Arthur brushed the copper shavings from his workbench, the metal flakes catching the thin Atlantic light. In the corner of the stone shed, a kettle began to hum. He didn't need to look at the clock to know it was exactly 4 in the afternoon. He navigated the space by sound, the rhythmic click of the cooling furnace, the whistling wind through the gaps in the granite walls, and the soft, uneven scuff of Pippa's boots on the gravel outside. Pippa entered with a cluster of damp sea kale in her hand. She placed the salt-crusted greens next to a disassembled sonar array without a word. She was 6, but she possessed a stillness that felt centuries old. She watched her father's hands, which were scarred and steady, as he tightened a screw on a nautical clock. "It's breathing again," she whispered, leaning her ear toward the brass casing. Arthur paused. He didn't use the tools of his former life, the oscilloscopes or the digital frequency analyzers that once defined his existence in the Navy. Those lived in a locked chest beneath the floorboards, casualties of a guilt that remained as heavy as lead in his chest. He worked now with wood, wire, and physical vibrations. He was a man who fixed things that the modern world considered junk. "It's just mechanical tension, Pip," Arthur said, his voice low and gravelly from years of disuse. "No," she insisted, her eyes fixing on his. "It's a secret. You're helping it find the beat." Arthur turned away to pour the tea. The village of St. Jude viewed him as a ghost, a man who had crawled out of a high-tech wreckage to hide in a crumbling lifeboat station. They brought him broken radios and jammed fishing reels, paying him in eggs or coal. He accepted the pittance because it kept him invisible. Being devalued was a safety net. If the world thought he was nothing more than a hermit with a knack for springs, it would leave him alone with his daughter. The institutional pressure of his past life felt like a distant storm, but the clouds never truly cleared. Every month, a formal envelope arrived from the ministry, a cold reminder of the non-disclosure agreements and the technical negligence that sat on his record like a permanent stain. They owned his silence, and he gave it to them willingly. It was the price for keeping Pippa away from the sterile hallways of state-mandated care that followed the loss of her mother. As the sun dipped toward the jagged Cornish horizon, a sound began to tear through the natural ambience of the coast. It wasn't the roar of a fishing boat or the cry of a gull. It was a high-frequency whine, so sharp it made the fine hairs on Arthur's arms stand up. It was the sound of immense power struggling against the elements. Looking out the salt-stained window, he saw it, a white shape, jagged and monolithic, cutting through the swell. It was a super-8, a vessel of glass and steel that looked like a fallen shard of the moon. It was moving too fast for the shallow reef, its stabilizers fighting a losing battle against the erratic local currents. "Daddy, the big boat is crying," Pippa said, covering her ears. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He knew that sound. It was the protest of a sophisticated acoustic sensor, failing to read the granite teeth of the shoreline. The vessel was blind, drowning in its own data. He watched as the yacht slowed, its engines churning the water into a frantic foam just yards from the Blackrock shelf. A smaller, sleek tender detached from its side, racing toward the old stone pier of the village. Arthur walked to the door, his hand resting on the latch. He had spent years ensuring no one had a reason to knock. He looked at Pippa, who was still holding her ears, her face pale. The discomfort in his daughter's expression did what the sight of the billion-dollar ship could not. It pulled him out of his self-imposed exile. He stepped onto the porch, the wind whipping his coat, and waited as the strangers approached his gate. The woman who stepped off the tender did not fit the rugged landscape of St. Jude. Her coat was a sharp, architectural gray that defied the wind, and her eyes scanned the dilapidated station with the clinical detachment of someone used to seeing assets rather than homes. Behind her, 2 men in dark uniforms carried a heavy equipment case. "Arthur Penhaligon?" she asked. It wasn't a question. It was a verification of data. Arthur didn't move from the doorway. He kept his body positioned to shield Pippa from view. "I fix clocks and fishing gear. You're looking for a marina in Falmouth." "I am Cassandra Vance," she said, as if the name were a key that turned every lock in the country. "My daughter is on that ship. The onboard systems are experiencing a catastrophic resonance failure." Your name is the only one in the Admiralty archives associated with the specific acoustic dampening we require. Those archives are old, Arthur replied, his voice flat. And I don't work for the Navy anymore. I'm not the Navy. I am a mother whose child is currently in physical agony because of a hardware glitch your work was supposed to prevent. The bluntness of her words hit him harder than any legal threat. He looked past her to the white monolith on the water. Inside that hull, someone was suffering from the very technology he had helped perfect, and then failed to save. Against his better judgment, Arthur stepped toward the men and the case. They opened it to reveal a set of advanced telecom headsets, the most expensive neural audio interfaces on the market. They were sleek, silver, and vibrating with a low-frequency hum that Arthur could feel in his teeth. Lily has been in a state of sensory shock for 3 hours, Cassandra said, her composure finally fracturing at the edges. The local doctors want to sedate her into a coma. My engineers say the software is fine, but she's screaming that the silence is stabbing her. Arthur looked at the device. He didn't need a diagnostic computer to see the problem. The silver casing was too rigid. The feedback loop was trapped between the bone conduction plates. It was a masterpiece of engineering that lacked a soul. He turned back to his workshop and grabbed a small leather pouch of hand tools and a strip of cured driftwood he had been shaping for a violin bridge. I'm not stepping foot on that ship, Arthur said. Cassandra's face hardened. I can buy this entire coastline, Mr. Penhaligon. Do not mistake a request for a negotiation. If you want my help, bring her here, Arthur countered, ignoring the threat. This station is grounded in granite. The ship is a metal drum. If she's in resonance shock, the ocean is just making it worse. Bring her to the stone. An hour later, a stretcher was carried up the cliff path. The girl, Lily, looked smaller than her 14 years. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and her hands were clamped over the silver discs fixed behind her ears. She wasn't crying. She was vibrating, her breath coming in jagged, shallow hitches. Arthur cleared the workbench, pushing aside the nautical clock. He signaled for the men to lay her down. Cassandra stood in the corner, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like a woman realizing that her empire provided no shield against a child's pain. Arthur leaned over the girl. He didn't touch the silver discs yet. Instead, he took the piece of driftwood and tapped it gently against the stone floor, then held the wood near Lily's hand. Lily, he said, his voice dropping into the resonant frequency he used to calm Pippa. I can't turn off the world, but I can change the song. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, crude coil of copper wire. He began to bridge the gap between the high-tech implants and the organic wood. It was a violation of every safety protocol in the advanced telecom manual. It was a risk that could end his life as a free man if it failed. He looked at Cassandra. The rules say I need a clean room and a certified technician. I have a hammer and a piece of a shipwreck. Decide now. Cassandra looked at her daughter, who was beginning to claw at her own skin. Do it, she whispered. Arthur's hands, once blamed for a tragedy in the North Sea, did not shake. He bypassed the digital processor, forcing the sound to travel through the natural grain of the wood. He was attempting to ground a human nervous system into the earth itself. The small workshop fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic against the cliffs below. Arthur worked with a focused intensity that ignored the presence of the billionaire standing in his shadows. His fingers moved with a precision that was more tactile than visual. He wasn't looking at the girl's implants. He was feeling the tension in the copper wire, gauging the resistance of the wood. He pressed the driftwood bridge against the mastoid bone behind Lily's ear, securing it with a soft adhesive. Then he took a tuning fork from his belt, struck it against the stone hearth, and touched the vibrating metal to the wood. Lily's body lurched. Her eyes flew open, wide, panicked, and clouded with a deep, reflexive terror. Wait, Arthur murmured, his hand hovering just inches from her face, but never making contact. Don't fight the air. Listen to the stone. For a long, agonizing minute, the girl remained frozen. Cassandra moved forward, a protest forming on her lips, but Arthur held up a single hand. He didn't look back. He was watching the pulse in Lily's neck. Slowly, the frantic thrumming of her jugular began to slow. Her breathing, which had been a series of panicked gasps, smoothed into a long, shaky exhale. The silver discs of the Vance implants began to glow with a soft blue light, indicating they were finally syncing with the bypass Arthur had constructed. The harsh, digital screeching that had been echoing through her nervous system was being filtered through the natural density of the Cornish timber. Lily's hands, which had been clamped over her ears for hours, slowly fell to her sides. She looked up at the low, timbered ceiling of the station, her gaze drifting to the cracks in the plaster. "It's brown," she whispered. Her voice was thin, like paper tearing. "The sound?" Cassandra asked, rushing to the bedside. Lily shook her head slowly. "The world. It doesn't taste like metal anymore." She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked as though she might actually sleep. The rigid tension that had defined her frame vanished, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. Arthur stepped back, his chest heaving. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a hand stained with oil and salt. He felt the weight of what he had just done. He had broken the seal on a piece of technology protected by 1,000 patents and international safety laws. He had used a piece of debris to heal the daughter of a woman who could have him erased from society with a phone call. Pippa crept out from the shadows of the kitchen area, holding a cup of water. She walked past the men in uniforms, past the CEO of the world's largest telecom company, and stood by Lily's head. She offered the water, not to the mother, but to the girl on the table. Cassandra watched this interaction with a look of stunned displacement. She was a woman who dealt in global connectivity, yet she looked entirely disconnected from the simplicity of the moment. She looked at Arthur, her eyes moving from his scarred hands to the primitive tools on the bench. "How?" she asked. "My engineers said the frequency was perfect. They used the most advanced algorithms in the industry." "That's the problem," Arthur said, beginning to pack his tools away. "The algorithm is perfect. A human ear isn't. You tried to give her a world without friction. But without friction, there's no warmth. You were starving her with silence. You modified a Vance Tier 1 interface with a piece of a boat," Cassandra said, her voice regaining its sharp, corporate edge, though it was softened by a trace of awe. "Do you have any idea what the legal implications are? That device is proprietary. It's a violation of a dozen federal statutes." Arthur looked at her, his expression weary. The girl was breaking. The rules weren't fixing her. "I chose the girl." He knew the cost. By showing his hand, by proving he still possessed the acoustical intuition that had made him a legend and a scapegoat in the Navy, he had ended his life of invisibility. He had traded his safety for the comfort of a stranger's child. Cassandra stood tall, her gaze moving to the window where her superiate sat like a silent predator. "The system won't care about your intentions, Mr. Penhaligon. They will only see the breach." "I know," Arthur said, turning to Pippa. "But she's breathing now. That has to be enough." The first act of his new life had begun, and the price was already being calculated. The aftermath arrived not with a roar, but with the sterile hum of a satellite uplink. By the following morning, the cliffside was no longer a private sanctuary. Black SUVs lined the narrow dirt track, their tires churning the coastal mud into a dark slurry. Men in suits that cost more than Arthur's annual income stood near the old lifeboat ramp, holding tablets and speaking into earpieces. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, watching Pippa through the window. She was showing Lily how to find sea glass in the tide pools. Lily moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick, but the silver discs on her head remained silent, bridged by Arthur's wooden bypass. The girl looked at the waves with a curiosity that seemed to hurt, a raw awakening to a world she had been taught to fear. The door to the workshop opened without a knock. Cassandra entered, followed by a man with a face as sharp and cold as a razor blade. He carried a digital briefcase and a thick stack of legal documents. "This is Marcus Thorne," Cassandra said. Her tone had shifted. The vulnerability of the previous night was buried under a layer of industrial frost. "He is the head of the Vance Legal Division. He has some concerns regarding your intervention." Thorne didn't offer a handshake. He placed the briefcase on the workbench, right on top of Arthur's with shavings. Mr. Penhaligon, you have tampered with a Class 4 medical implant. You have bypassed encrypted proprietary software and introduced unsterilized organic material into a neural interface. From a regulatory standpoint, you haven't fixed the device. You have committed an act of corporate sabotage and child endangerment. Arthur didn't look up from his tea. The girl is walking. She isn't screaming anymore. A temporary anomaly, Thorne countered. The Vance board is concerned that your fix is a ticking clock. If that wood expands or the copper oxidizes, the surge could cause permanent neurological damage. We are here to seize the modified equipment and transport Lily to a facility in London for a full reset. Arthur stood up then, his height filling the small room. She isn't a piece of equipment, and she's finally hearing the world. If you take her back to that silent box, you'll lose her again. That is not your concern, Thorne said, sliding a document across the table. This is a cease and desist order. It also includes a formal notification of custody review. We have filed a report suggesting that this environment and your proximity to a minor constitutes a risk. A man with your history, living in a derelict building with a 6-year-old? The state tends to agree with us. The room went cold. Arthur felt a familiar, sickening pressure in his ears, the same weight he had felt when the North Sea took Liam. This was the system's true power. It didn't argue, it erased. It used the safety of children as a weapon to protect its own patents. Cassandra remained by the window, her back to the room. She was watching her daughter laugh, a sound so rare it should have been cherished. Yet, she said nothing to stop Thorne. She was a creature of the system, and the system demanded order. You're trying to bury the fact that a piece of driftwood did what your billion-dollar lab couldn't, Arthur said, his voice a low growl. We are protecting our intellectual property, Thorne replied, and we are protecting a child from an unlicensed, disgraced engineer. Outside, Lily tripped on a rock. Pippa caught her arm, steadying her. They stayed like that for a moment, two small figures against the vast, indifferent blue of the Atlantic. Lily didn't look toward the SUVs or the men in suits. She looked at Pippa, and then she looked toward the workshop, her eyes finding Arthur's through the glass. There was a plea in them, not for medicine, but for the right to remain present. You have 1 hour to surrender the prototype, Thorne said, checking his watch. After that, the local authorities will arrive to execute the custody mandate. Arthur looked at the man, then at Cassandra's rigid back. He realized then that the trial wasn't about technology. It was a judgment on his character. They were betting that he was still the man who would take the blame and vanish into the fog. They were betting he would choose his own safety over the truth of what he had built. He looked at his tools, then at the locked chest beneath the floorboards. The silence he had cultivated for years was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. Arthur did not move for a long time. The clock on the wall, the one he had fixed only days prior, ticked with a precision that felt like a heartbeat. He looked at the legal documents on the table, the black ink representing a world that valued the integrity of a circuit over the pulse of a human life. 1 hour, Thorne repeated, his voice as dry as parchment. Arthur walked past the men and opened the hatch in the floor. He reached into the dark space and pulled out the heavy, dust-covered trunk. When he opened it, the smell of ozone and old sea salt filled the room. Inside lay the high-fidelity sensors he had salvaged from the North Sea, the ones the Navy claimed had failed. He didn't look at the screens. He reached for a small, handheld diagnostic reader that he had built in secret years ago. What is that? Thorne asked, stepping closer. Proof, Arthur said. He walked out of the workshop and down to the tide pools. The wind was picking up, the summer air turning sharp and metallic. Lily and Pippa were sitting on a flat shelf of rock. Arthur knelt beside Lily. I need to check the bridge, Lily. It might feel a little cold. He connected the reader to the wooden bypass. On the small, monochrome screen, a wave pattern appeared. It wasn't the flat, jagged line of a digital signal. It was a soft, rolling curve that mimicked the movement of the water at their feet. Look at this, Arthur said, not to the girl, but to Cassandra, who had followed him out onto the rocks. Cassandra looked down at the screen. She had spent her life staring at data, but she had never seen anything like this. The signal is inconsistent. It's not inconsistent, Arthur corrected. It's organic. It's reacting to the wind and the pressure of the tide. Your engineers tried to create a perfect vacuum for her ears. But a heart doesn't beat in a vacuum. It beats against the world. Thorne arrived at the edge of the rocks, his phone already in his hand. Mr. Penhaligon, you are in direct violation of the order. I am calling the constabulary. Call them, Arthur said, standing up. He looked Cassandra directly in the eyes. You can take her back. You can put her in a room where nothing touches her and nothing hurts. You can protect your stock price and your patents. But look at her face right now. Lily was watching a crab scuttle through the kelp. She was flinching at the sharp sound of the waves, yes, but she wasn't retreating. She was leaning into it. A small, tentative smile was forming on her lips, not because the pain was gone, but because she was finally part of the mess of living. The system failed her because it didn't trust her to feel, Arthur said. Just like it failed Liam because it didn't trust the machine to scream when the pressure got too high. You're making the same mistake. Cassandra looked at Thorne, then at the black SUVs idling at the top of the cliff. She looked at her daughter's hand, which was currently buried in wet sand. The contrast was absolute. The sterile, expensive perfection of her empire versus the muddy, vibrant reality of the Cornish coast. Thorne, put the phone away, Cassandra said. Ma'am, the liability. I said put it away. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of a mountain. She walked toward Lily and knelt in the sand, ruining her expensive trousers without a second thought. She reached out and touched the wooden bridge behind Lily's ear. Does it hurt? Cassandra asked. No, Lily said softly. It sounds like home. The judgment was no longer about a legal document. It was being held here, on the edge of the world, between a mother and a daughter. Arthur stood back, his hand resting on Pippa's shoulder. He knew he was still at risk. He knew the system would not forgive the exposure of its own flaws. But as he watched Cassandra pull Lily into a hesitant, salt-smelling embrace, he realized that the status he had lost years ago was a hollow weight. This small, human resonance, was the only thing that had ever mattered. The following week felt like a slow intake of breath. The black vehicles remained at the top of the cliff, but the men in suits no longer paced the perimeter. Instead, they sat in the local pub, looking out of place among the fishermen, while Cassandra Vance moved into the small cottage attached to the station. The superyacht sat idle in the bay, its sophisticated lights flickering like a distant, irrelevant star. Inside the workshop, the atmosphere had shifted from a site of repair to a place of discovery. Arthur sat at the bench, his sleeves rolled up, showing Lily how to shave a piece of cedar. He didn't lecture. He simply pointed to the way the grain reacted to the blade. If you go against the growth, it resists, Arthur said, his voice steady. You have to find the direction it wants to go. Lily held the tool with trembling fingers. Her coordination was returning, the neurological fog lifting as her brain stopped fighting the digital wall. She wasn't a patient anymore. She was a student of the physical world. Cassandra watched from the doorway. She had replaced her gray coat with a heavy wool sweater borrowed from a local shop. She looked less like a titan of industry and more like a woman who had forgotten how to be still. She watched Arthur move with a quiet, unassuming authority. He didn't ask for her approval, and he didn't flinch under her gaze. My board is meeting in London tomorrow, Cassandra said, stepping into the scent of sawdust. They are preparing a statement to distance the company from your modifications. They want to frame this as an isolated incident involving a rogue element. Arthur didn't stop his work. Is that what you're going to tell them? I told them I'm staying here, she replied. She walked to the window, looking at Pippa, who was teaching Lily how to stack stones in a way that defied the wind. They threatened to remove me as CEO. They say my judgment is compromised by emotion. Is it? Cassandra turned to him, her face stripped of its corporate mask. For the first time in 14 years, I am seeing my daughter instead of a problem to be solved. If that is a compromise, then the system is more broken than I realized. The tension reached its peak on Thursday. Marcus Thorne returned, not with documents, but with a technician from the Ministry of Defense. They stood in the center of the workshop, a stark contrast to the rustic surroundings. "Mr. Penhaligon," the technician said, his voice clipped, "we've reviewed the logs from the North Sea incident. The data you've uncovered with this device suggests the acoustic failure was predictable. It also suggests you weren't the one who ignored the warning." Arthur felt a hollow echo in his chest. For years, he had carried the weight of Liam's death, believing his own silence was the only way to protect what was left of his life. "We are offering a full reinstatement," Thorne added, though his eyes remained cold. "A formal apology, a pension, and a directorship at our new research hub in Bristol. In exchange, you will sign over the rights to this bypass technology and allow us to handle the public narrative." It was the ultimate status reversal. The man they had tried to erase was now being offered a seat at the table. He could have the wealth, the respect, and the power he had lost. He could ensure Pippa never had to worry about a cold winter again. Arthur looked at the silver-haired men, then at the piece of wood in Lily's hand. He looked at Pippa, who was watching him with wide, knowing eyes. "I don't want the chair," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the stone room. "And I don't want the apology." "Mr. Penhaligon, be reasonable," Thorne urged. "This is everything you lost." "No," Arthur said. "What I lost was the belief that people matter more than the machines we built for them. You're not offering me that back. You're offering me a bigger cage." He walked over to Lily and adjusted the wooden bridge, his touch light and certain. "The technology belongs to the people who need it, not to a patent office." The rejection was absolute. The system had exposed its moral failure, offering a bribe where it should have offered a change of heart. Arthur stood his ground, a man whose integrity was no longer for sale. The standoff in the workshop did not end with a handshake or a signature. It ended with a quiet departure. Thorne and the technician left, their shoes clicking sharply on the stone path, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy. Arthur spent the evening by the fireplace, the warmth of the embers reflecting in the brass components of the nautical clock. He knew the institutional pressure would not vanish overnight. There would be more letters, more meetings in glass towers he would never visit, and perhaps more threats. But the power they held over him, the power of shame, had been extinguished. Lily stayed in the cottage that night. For the first time, she didn't need the heavy, noise-canceling curtains drawn. She sat by the window, listening to the low groan of the tide and the distant whistle of the wind in the chimney. "It's not loud," she told her mother. "It's just there." Cassandra sat on the floor beside her daughter's chair. She had spent a decade building walls of signal and steel, thinking she was creating a safe harbor. Now she looked at the simple wooden device on the table, the bridge Arthur had carved, and saw it for what it was, a connection. It wasn't about the absence of noise. It was about the presence of a person who cared enough to listen. Arthur walked in, carrying a tray of tea. He noticed the way Cassandra looked at the device. "It's just cedar and copper," he said, setting the tray down. "No," Cassandra replied, looking up at him. "It's the first thing that didn't treat her like a broken circuit. I spent billions trying to find a genius, Arthur. I should have been looking for a man who knew how to stay still." She stood up, her movements regaining a different kind of grace, one that wasn't born of command, but of clarity. "The board will try to sue you. They will try to claim you stole the frequency patterns. But they can't sue a feeling, and they can't own the resonance of the ocean." Arthur looked at the small, scarred hands of his daughter, who was asleep on the sofa with her head resting on a cushion. He realized that his integrity had provided more security than any bank account ever could. He had shown Pippa that standing by the truth was the only way to truly live. The night air was cool, smelling of salt and damp earth. Arthur stepped onto the porch, looking out at the dark expanse of the Atlantic. The superyacht was gone, having slipped away under the cover of dusk, leaving the babe back to the local boats. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone Pippa had given him. He felt its weight, its solid reality. He wasn't the disgraced engineer from the North Sea anymore. He wasn't the hermit of St. Jude. He was a father who had found his voice by helping a child find hers. The distancing he had felt from the world for 4 years began to dissolve. He wasn't afraid of the sound anymore. He was ready to hear what came next. The light of the following morning was soft, filtering through the sea mist that clung to the cliffs of St. Jude. Arthur stood by the window, watching the two girls near the shoreline. Lily was walking without her stick, her movements fluid as she followed Pippa toward a cluster of rock pools. Behind them, the old lifeboat station stood firm, a silent witness to the shift that had occurred within its walls. Cassandra joined him, holding a mug of coffee. She looked at the horizon, where the first hint of gold was breaking through the gray. "I've resigned," she said. The statement was simple, lacking the drama of a corporate announcement. The board wanted a battle. I decided to give him a ghost instead. Arthur nodded, understanding the weight of that choice. "What happens now?" "Now, we build something that doesn't require a patent to function," she replied. She looked at the workshop, where the nautical clock was finally humming in perfect rhythm. "I want to fund a center here. Not a lab. A place where people like Lily can learn to hear again, on their own terms. I want you to lead it, Arthur. Not as an employee, but as a partner." Arthur looked at his hands. For years, they had been tools of penance, fixing the broken remnants of other people's lives while his own remained fractured. He thought of Liam and the North Sea, the guilt that had been his only companion for so long. He realized then that the debt was paid. The healing he had provided for Lily had, in turn, mended the silent spaces within himself. "I'll stay here," Arthur said. "Pippa belongs to this coast, and I think I've spent enough time hiding from the noise." He walked out to the porch and called out to the girls. Pippa looked up, her face bright with a jagged, honest joy. She ran toward him, her pockets heavy with shells and smooth stones. Lily followed at a slower pace, her eyes fixed on the movement of the grass in the wind. She stopped in front of Arthur and touched the wooden bridge behind her ear. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the wood. It was always there, Lily," Arthur said gently. "You just needed a way to feel it." As the sun rose higher, the village of St. Jude began to wake. The sound of fishing boat engines and the calls of the gulls filled the air. It wasn't a perfect symphony, but it was a human one. Arthur took Pippa's hand and looked out at the water. The scarcity that had defined his life, the emotional and material lack, had been replaced by a quiet, sustainable hope. He wasn't a man of status or power. He was a father, a craftsman, and a protector of the small acts of humanity that keep the world from turning cold. The stone walls of the station felt warm under his palm. The vibration of the earth was steady. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the heartbeat of the coast. He didn't need to prove anything to the world anymore. He was seen. He was respected. And for the first time in a very long time, he was home.